It was a quiet night over the Pacific Ocean when the sky changed color. Fishermen far from shore saw a bright line cut across the dark clouds. For a moment, it looked like a falling star. Then the line grew brighter, until it became a burning trail. The sound came seconds later, a low roar that rolled across the waves and shook the small boats. Many thought it was a meteor, but a few saw the strange glow that came after. Something big entered the water, leaving steam and ripples that rose higher than the masts of their ships. They waited for the explosion that should have followed, but the sea only hissed and then there was silence again. When the Coast Guards picked up the first calls, they believed it was a plane crash. Rescue helicopters flew out before dawn. By the time the first light touched the water, they saw floating pieces that looked like no airplane they had ever seen. Some fragments were curved like silver shells, smooth and cold. Others were transparent and shimmered like melted glass. Divers went down and found a wreck deeper than expected. In the middle of the wreck lay a round chamber that still glowed faintly blue. Inside were bodies, small, thin, wrapped in suits that clung to their skin. One of them moved weakly, and the divers froze. The body's eyes opened, large and dark, full of fear and pain. The divers didn't know what to do. Their training had never covered this. But the leader, a man named Rafi, made the choice to bring them up. The survivors were breathing, though their breath sounded soft and shallow. They were alive, but barely. When they reached the deck, everyone gathered around. No one spoke for a long time. The air smelled like metal and salt. The small beings coughed, trembling. One of them tried to raise a hand toward the sun, as if surprised it was real. A young medic took off her gloves and reached out. The moment their fingers touched, both flinched. But the medic saw fear, not threat, in those eyes. Within hours, military ships arrived. They ordered the fishermen and coast guards to leave the area. All phones and cameras were taken. The wreck was pulled aboard and covered under heavy tarps. The survivors were moved to a sealed medical facility on a nearby island. The news reported a fallen satellite and a cleanup operation. Only a handful of people knew the truth. The divers signed papers promising silence, but one of them couldn't keep it. Late that night, Rafi sent a single picture to his brother, who posted it online before deleting it. The picture showed a small figure on a stretcher, covered with a silver sheet but with one thin hand visible. The hand didn't look human. The image spread faster than anyone could stop it. Inside the facility, confusion ruled. Doctors and scientists in white suits surrounded the injured beings. Their suits were removed carefully, revealing pale skin with faint patterns that looked almost like markings. Their hearts beat slower than human ones, but stronger. Their blood had a faint glow under light. They didn't speak, but when frightened, their skin shimmered as if reflecting emotion. The doctors couldn't communicate, so they tried symbols and gestures. Nothing worked. Then one linguist, a quiet woman who had studied rare languages, noticed that they responded to tone more than words. She began humming softly, and to everyone's surprise, the beings relaxed. One even reached out its hand toward her voice. As days passed, they began to understand a little. Through pictures and motions, the survivors told their story. They came from a place far away, beyond even the stars known to humans. Their world had been torn apart by war. They had escaped on a small craft, hoping to find peace somewhere safe. But the damage from the war had followed them. Their ship had lost power and been caught by Earth's gravity. The crash had not been planned. They had not come to invade, explore, or conquer. They had come by accident. They were refugees. When this truth reached a few officials, the debate began. Some said they should be kept hidden. Others argued that the world had the right to know. A secret meeting was called in a cold room with no windows. Scientists spoke about risk of disease or technology theft. The military feared panic, but one old general said something that silenced them all. He said, "If they ran from war, then they are like us. We have seen what war does. Maybe it's our turn to help." His words didn't change the plan, but they stayed in the room like a quiet echo. Outside, curiosity grew. The picture had already gone viral and people were making theories. Some said it was fake. Some said it was proof that the government was hiding aliens. A few said it didn't matter what they were, only that they looked afraid. Around the world, news channels replayed the same blurry photo. Talk shows argued. Scientists gave calm interviews saying the image could not be verified. Yet deep down, many people felt something real had happened. Inside the facility, life continued in secrecy. The refugees, 6 in total, were slowly recovering. They didn't eat like humans, but absorbed liquid light that scientists couldn't explain. They communicated in flashes of color that sometimes matched human emotions: blue when calm, red when scared, white when grateful. The nurse who had first touched one of them kept visiting. She talked to them softly even if they couldn't understand her words. She told them about the ocean, the wind, and the stars. One night, when she was alone with them, one refugee touched her wrist and whispered a sound. It was broken and slow, but it sounded like safe. She cried quietly, afraid that no one would believe her. Then things changed. Strange readings appeared on satellite systems around the same area where the crash had been. At first, experts thought it was debris falling from orbit. But the signals repeated, like someone searching. The scientists studying the refugees noticed their lights flicker faster when those signals appeared, like a warning. One of them drew a symbol on the glass wall, a spiral with sharp edges, and then made a gesture of fear. The translators realized they were being hunted, but all of that was still in the future. In those first few days after the crash, humanity stood in silence. Governments argued behind locked doors. People online tried to guess the truth. The ocean kept its secrets. The divers who had found the wreck were relocated and told to forget. Yet they couldn't forget the sight of those eyes, full of exhaustion and trust. A week later, a storm passed over the island. Winds tore through the trees and waves rose high. The facility's power flickered. In the darkness, the refugees began to glow softly, lighting the room like candles. The nurse watched in wonder as they joined hands and formed a circle. The storm outside grew quieter, as if their presence calmed it. When the power returned, everything was still. She told the scientists what she had seen, but they dismissed it as imagination. Still, the nurse knew there was something about them that the world would one day understand. Back on the mainland, Rafi sat in his small home by the sea. The government had questioned him for hours and threatened him to stay silent, but when he looked out at the horizon, he couldn't regret his choice. He thought about those beings, lost and scared, and how the first thing they did when they saw humans was reach out. He wondered if maybe that was what humanity needed, to remember that even in fear there could be kindness. That night, a new light appeared far above the clouds. It wasn't bright like the crash had been, but steady and distant, like an eye watching. Most people didn't notice, but those who did said it didn't move like a star. It stayed there silent and patient, as if waiting. On the island, the refugees seemed restless. Their lights changed colors again and again. The nurse felt uneasy. She didn't understand their words, but she understood their fear. Something was coming. She didn't know that this was only the beginning of a story that would test what it meant to be human. It had been 2 weeks since the crash, and the island had turned into a place of mystery and fear. The government had covered the truth under many words and codes. They called it a weather research zone, and no one was allowed near. Helicopters came and went every day carrying boxes that no one could see inside. The soldiers guarding the gates didn't speak to anyone. Inside the walls, the refugees were still recovering, but the silence around them had started to grow heavy. The nurse who had cared for them kept her promise and came every morning with food and light. She didn't know if they needed food the way humans did, but she brought it anyway. Sometimes they would take the small bowl of glowing liquid and hold it near their chest until it faded into their skin. They had stopped trembling. Their eyes followed her when she walked around. One of them had begun to make a soft sound when she entered the room, something between a hum and a breath, and she liked to think it was a greeting. The scientists tried every day to learn more. They brought in machines that could scan through walls and cameras that could read body heat. They didn't know what to call them yet. Some said visitors, others said subjects. But the nurse called them guests. The linguist who had made the first contact was still working in another room. She spent hours studying the recordings of their sounds. She believed that their language was not made of words but of tones and light. She made a small machine that could replay soft pulses of color mixed with sound waves. When she used it near them, they seemed calmer. One night she recorded a series of pulses they made while sleeping and found a rhythm that looked like music. It was slow and repeating like a heartbeat. Outside, the world was not calm at all. The leaked picture had grown into a storm of news. Some people said it was fake. Some said it was proof of contact. Some said it was the beginning of invasion. Protests started near military bases demanding truth. Others prayed in front of churches believing the beings were messengers. The governments of several countries met in secret, but none of them agreed on what to do. Every nation wanted to know if the crash had landed in their waters or someone else's. The truth was it had happened too far from any border to belong to anyone. The nurse noticed that the refugees were healing faster than expected. Their skin, which had been pale and cracked, now looked smooth again. Their eyes had changed from black to a soft gray. They no longer looked lost. One day she saw one of them trying to draw on the glass wall with its finger. The light from its skin left faint trails like a child's doodle. She brought a tablet and showed simple pictures of Earth, of people, of animals. The refugee pointed at the image of a bird and made a sound. She smiled and repeated it. The next day it made the same sound again when it saw her. She began to think that learning their way of speaking was not impossible. Then one evening the lights in the facility flickered again. The soldiers ran through the halls and alarms flashed. A technician shouted that they were getting strange readings from the sky. The scientists rushed to the control room. On the radar screen were several moving points that had not been there before. They moved too fast to be planes and too straight to be meteors. The linguist felt her stomach twist. She looked at the refugees through the glass and saw their colors change to deep red. They were afraid. The general in charge ordered radio silence. The world outside would not be told anything. The next morning the lights were normal again, but everyone could feel the tension. The nurse found the refugees sitting together close to the wall. One of them looked at her and placed a hand against the glass. She hesitated and placed her own hand against it. A faint warmth passed through. She felt something like sadness. She whispered that they were safe, but even as she said it, she wasn't sure if it was true. Far away in cities and villages, people kept watching the sky. Some said they saw flashes that vanished too quickly to be lightning. News anchors laughed nervously about strange clouds. Scientists gave calm explanations that didn't sound convincing. Something was coming and everyone could feel it. The linguist began to notice that the refugees reacted to certain radio frequencies. When nearby devices sent certain signals, their skin shimmered. She realized they could feel electromagnetic waves like humans feel heat. She started using soft signal patterns to speak to them. One day, one of them finally responded with a clear tone that matched one of her patterns. She translated it into a simple idea. The meaning was close to home gone. She repeated the signal slowly. The refugee answered again with fire. The linguist stopped. She understood then that their planet had been destroyed, and that they had seen it happen. She went to the general and told him they were not soldiers but survivors. He listened but didn't answer. Later she heard the scientists whispering that the strange signals in the sky were getting stronger. They thought someone might be searching for the crash site. The government didn't want panic, so they kept it quiet. But the nurse and the linguist could see the fear growing in the refugees every day. They didn't sleep much. They sat close together as if waiting for something terrible. Raffi, the diver who had found them, lived far away now under another name. But he kept following the news. He saw strange weather reports near the same area, and he felt something wasn't right. He told a journalist friend that the crash wasn't a plane, that it was real and that the world should know. The friend laughed at first, but when another light appeared in the sky over the Pacific, he started listening. He told Raffi to hide and promised to find proof. A week later, the journalist disappeared. Back on the island, the nurse brought flowers into the room. The refugees watched her place them in a bowl of water. They seemed fascinated by the color. One of them touched a petal and it glowed softly for a moment. The nurse smiled and said thank you. The word made them curious. They tried to copy it. The sound came out broken but close. The nurse laughed. She didn't know that in a few days that word would mean more than anything else. That night the linguist recorded a long signal from the sky. It was a series of repeating bursts growing louder each hour. She played it near the refugees and their colors turned white and blue like panic. One of them stood up and pressed both hands against the glass and made a loud sound that cracked the speaker. The nurse ran in thinking something was wrong, but the linguist stopped her. She realized the refugees were saying the same sound again and again. It wasn't random. It was a name or a warning. By dawn, the radar screens showed something large entering the upper atmosphere. The base went into lockdown. The general shouted orders, soldiers ran to stations, and the nurse was told to leave the room. She refused. The refugees had gathered together and their glow filled the whole space. It pulsed faster and faster as if they were trying to send a message out into the sky. The linguist stood beside them holding her small transmitter. She didn't know if anyone out there could hear, but she felt she had to try. When the first tremor shook the ground, everyone froze. It was not an earthquake. It was something breaking through the air above them. A second later, a deep sound filled the air. Not like thunder, but like a voice of the wind itself. The soldiers looked at the sky and saw lights moving in formation high above the clouds. The linguist whispered that they had found them. The nurse didn't understand who she meant, but she saw tears in the refugees' eyes. The lights stayed in the sky for a long time without moving closer. Then as suddenly as they had appeared, they vanished. The base stayed on alert for hours. When morning came, the refugees had stopped glowing. They sat quietly, almost still. The linguist walked in slowly and asked what had happened, but they didn't answer. One of them looked at her and drew the same spiral symbol again on the glass. She asked what it meant, but no sound came. The nurse felt her chest grow tight. She knew it meant danger. That day the general sent urgent messages to the mainland. He didn't tell his soldiers what he had seen in the sky. He only said to prepare. The nurse was sent away to a different post, but before leaving, she turned to look at the refugees one last time. One of them raised a hand slowly, and the same soft light touched the glass. She raised her hand too and smiled, even though tears filled her eyes. She didn't know if she would ever see them again. In the following days, the world noticed strange things. Radios picked up signals that made no sense. Oceans grew warmer in certain places. Birds flew in wrong directions. People said they could feel a pressure in the air as if the planet itself was holding its breath. The story of the crash began to fade under other news, but those who had seen the lights that night never forgot. The linguist stayed on the island working day and night. She believed the refugees were trying to warn them about something. She just didn't know what. She wrote in her notes that they were peaceful and frightened and that whatever had destroyed their world might now be coming closer. She hoped humanity would understand before it was too late. And somewhere far above the clouds, a faint light blinked again like an eye opening in the dark. The refugees looked up from their room and shivered. They knew that their hunters had found the trail at last, and that Earth would soon have to make a choice it had never faced before. Fear began to spread across the world like smoke after fire, and no one could stop it. People did not know what was real anymore. Some believed the skylights were secret human weapons. Others believed they were more of the same visitors who had crashed in the ocean. The governments kept silent, but the silence only made the fear worse. On the island base, the mood had changed. The soldiers no longer joked or talked. They moved quickly and kept their eyes on the sky. The refugees sat together most of the time, watching the horizon through the small glass window. They did not eat and they barely moved. The linguist tried to talk to them, but they stayed quiet. The colors on their skin had grown dim. She could feel that they were waiting for something, and she was afraid to ask what it was. The nurse who had been sent away could not stop thinking about them. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the small hand touching the glass and the sad light that followed. She asked for news, but no one would tell her anything. Finally, she decided to go back, even if it meant breaking the rules. She took a boat from a nearby port and reached the island at night. The guard stopped her, but she told them she was a medical worker on order. They didn't check too hard because everyone was nervous. She walked into the building and found the linguist sitting alone in the monitoring room, staring at the screens. The woman looked tired and pale. She told the nurse that things were getting worse. Strange signals were filling the sky again. Something big was approaching from space, and they couldn't hide it for long. The nurse asked about the refugees, and the linguist took her to see them. When they entered the room, the air felt heavy. The beings looked thinner than before. Their glow was weak. One of them opened its eyes when it saw her and tried to stand, but fell back. The Nurse ran to help and held it up gently. It made a soft sound that broke her heart. She whispered that everything would be fine, but she didn't believe it herself. The linguist placed a small device on the table that translated a few of their tones. When the refugee spoke again, the machine made a faint voice that said, "Danger soon." The nurse froze. The linguist asked what kind of danger. The next translation came slowly. It said, "They are coming." Before she could ask who they were, an alarm began to ring. The soldiers outside started shouting orders. The linguist grabbed the radio, but the signal was full of noise. Through the window, she saw streaks of light in the distance. Not shooting stars, but ships entering the atmosphere. The refugees started glowing again, their colors turning from pale white to deep red. The nurse tried to calm them, but they were too afraid. The ground shook and dust fell from the ceiling. The soldiers ran past the hall with weapons ready. The general shouted for lockdown. No one knew if it was an attack or a landing. The nurse and the linguist hid with the refugees in the inner room. They could hear explosions far away over the ocean. The refugees held each other close, and their lights began to pulse like hearts beating faster and faster. The linguist realized they were sending a signal, maybe to warn others or to protect the base. Then, as suddenly as it began, the noise outside stopped. The ground went quiet. They waited for a long time before the general called over the radio that the sky was clear again. He said the objects had changed course at the last minute and gone back into orbit. No one knew why. The linguist thought maybe the refugees had done something to protect them. The nurse looked at them and whispered, "Thank you." The next day, the world found out. Satellite pictures leaked, showing shapes above the atmosphere. News channels called them crafts. Governments could no longer deny the truth. Panic began to spread everywhere. Some people prayed, others prepared weapons. Cities held emergency meetings. Some countries wanted to attack first before the unknown ships did. Others said they should try peace. For the first time, humanity had to think not about power but survival. In the base, the general was told to move the refugees to a secret place inland, but he refused. He said the island was safer because it was surrounded by water. The nurse stayed by their side day and night. She told them about the people outside who were arguing about what to do. The refugees listened quietly, and one of them touched her arm and made the word safe again. She wondered if they still believed Earth was safe. Rafi the diver heard about the lights on the news and knew they were the same ones he had seen before. He felt a strange pull to go back. He couldn't explain it to anyone. He just knew he had been part of the beginning and couldn't run from the end. He took his small boat again and started toward the island. The sea was rough, but he didn't turn back. Meanwhile, the linguist had found a pattern in the refugees' signals. It showed a repeating rhythm that matched the movements of the objects in orbit. She realized they were communicating. The message they sent seemed to be a plea, not a threat. She played back part of the translation, and it said, "We run from them, we want peace." The linguist brought the recording to the general, but he didn't know what to do with it. He said even if it was true, no one would believe it. The world only saw danger when it looked at the sky now. That night a storm came again. The waves crashed against the island and lightning flashed. The power went out just like before. The refugees began to glow again, but this time the light was stronger, filling the whole room with silver color. The nurse covered her eyes. The linguist held the translator up and heard faint words. It said, "We can hide you." Before she could ask what that meant, the lights flickered back on and the refugees were silent again. The next morning, Rafi's boat reached the shore. The soldiers tried to stop him, but he shouted that he had found them first and he wasn't leaving. The general recognized his name and let him in for a moment. When he saw the refugees again, he felt both fear and love. He told the nurse that he wanted to help. The linguist warned that the world might soon come for them, not the ones in the sky, but humans themselves. The fear of the unknown was spreading faster than truth. She showed him messages from the outside world. People were demanding that the government hand over the aliens. Some said they were spies, some said they brought sickness. Others believed helping them would bring war. The nurse couldn't believe how quickly kindness had turned into fear. She looked at the refugees who had done nothing but try to survive. She asked the linguist what could be done. The linguist said maybe if they could show the world their message, it would change hearts. But the general said it was too dangerous. The governments had already ordered the refugees to be moved to a hidden base. That night, trucks were prepared to transport them. The nurse begged the general to wait. She said the refugees were weak and moving them could kill them. He shook his head and said orders were orders. The soldiers entered the room to take them. The refugees looked frightened. One of them made a sudden sharp sound and all the lights went out again. When they came back on, the soldiers were frozen in place, unable to move for a few seconds. The refugees were glowing blue now, not red. The linguist said they were not attacking but asking for mercy. The general stopped the soldiers and told everyone to leave the room. He asked the linguist to explain what they wanted. She used her device to ask simple questions. The translator answered slowly. It said, "We do not bring war, we bring warning." The general asked, "Warning of what?" The answer came after a long pause. It said, "The hunters are close." The general's face went pale. Outside, the radio picked up new signals again, stronger than before. The world was about to face something it had never seen. The general looked at the nurse, at the linguist, at Rafi, and then at the refugees. He finally said, "Maybe we should believe them." He ordered all military communication open to the world. For the first time, he told the truth on record that visitors had come not as invaders, but as refugees running from a greater enemy. The message went public within hours. Some people believed, some laughed, but most were silent. That night, the sky was full of lights again, but they were not the same. They were brighter, closer, and moving fast. People in cities looked up and forgot to breathe. The nurse stood by the window of the island base and saw the horizon glowing red. She turned to the refugees who were standing together with calm faces. One of them said in a broken voice that this was the beginning. She didn't know if that meant the beginning of war or hope. Across the world, humanity faced a question it had never faced before. Would it run, or would it stand between danger and those who had come seeking help? The answer was still hidden in the hearts of millions. The sky kept burning and the wind carried a strange, new sound that was neither thunder nor machine, but something alive and waiting. The sky stayed red for many hours, and people all over the world stood outside, their homes watching in silence. The lights were no longer small dots like stars. They moved slowly and left long trails behind them. Every few minutes one would blink and vanish and another would appear somewhere else. No one knew if it was a message or a warning. The news channels kept showing the same pictures and every expert said something different. Some said it was space debris. Some said it was ships. Others said it was a natural event that looked strange but was not dangerous. Yet no one believed them because fear was already in the air. People started buying food and fuel and blocking roads. Governments called emergency meetings. Soldiers were told to stand by. The world was changing again and everyone could feel it. On the island, the general called everyone into the control room. The screen showed strange symbols moving across the radar. The linguist said they were not random because the shapes were repeating in a pattern. The refugees sat quietly in their room watching the sky through the small window. Their bodies glowed in soft white light as if they were preparing for something. The nurse stayed with them while the general and the linguist tried to make sense of the new signals. Rafi stood outside near the water, staring at the reflection of the red sky. He had never seen the ocean look so angry. Then something unexpected happened. The radio that had been full of static suddenly went clear. A voice came through, but it was not human. It was deep and slow and filled with echoes. No one could understand the words. The refugees reacted immediately. Their colors turned red and blue at once. The linguist tried to record the sound and match it with the signals she had collected earlier. When she played it back through her translator, the machine gave a short translation. It said, "We found you." The nurse felt cold all over. She turned to the refugees and asked what that meant. One of them looked at her and spoke softly. The translator repeated their answer. It said they are the destroyers. The general ordered all power shut down to avoid being detected, but it was too late. The skylights grew brighter until the whole ocean shone like glass. A large shadow appeared above the clouds, so big that it blocked part of the stars. It did not move like a normal ship. It stayed still, as if watching. The refugees began to hum in low voices that vibrated through the walls. The nurse covered her ears, but the sound was not loud. It was deep and sad and strong. The linguist realized they were sending another signal, maybe to call for peace or to hide the base. All communication with the mainland stopped. The general tried to reach command, but there was only static. He told everyone to stay calm, but his voice was shaking. Rafi went to help the soldiers prepare boats in case they had to escape. The waves were already rising higher. The nurse refused to leave the refugees. She said if they had brought the danger here, then it was unfair to leave them alone. The linguist stayed too. She said they needed to understand what was happening because maybe the refugees knew how to stop it. Hours passed with no change. The sky stayed red and the shadow above the clouds did not move. Then small flashes appeared in the distance like lightning without thunder. The refugees flinched every time one flashed. The linguist counted the rhythm and realized it matched the pulse pattern of the refugees' light. It was a message from the hunters. She played part of it through the translator, but the meaning came out broken. It said, "Return or perish." The nurse looked at the refugees who were now glowing white. They did not answer, but she could feel they had made a choice. Suddenly, the shadow in the sky began to fade. It moved higher until it vanished again. The red glow softened into pink and then to gray. The sea grew calm. Everyone on the island felt relief but also confusion. The linguist checked her readings. The signals were gone. The general said maybe they had left, but the refugees shook their heads slowly. One of them spoke through the translator saying they wait. The linguist asked why they would wait. The answer came as they learn us. The nurse understood what that meant. The hunters were studying Earth before acting. Over the next few days, the world tried to return to normal, but nothing felt normal anymore. Some cities declared peace days and told people to stay home. Others built shelters underground. Leaders made public talks telling everyone to stay calm. Many people did not believe anything the leaders said anymore. They turned to their own groups and made their own plans. In many places, people began to fight each other out of fear. The linguist listened to radio broadcasts from around the world and felt ashamed. Humanity was breaking apart before anything had even happened. In the island base, the refugees grew stronger again. They walked around the room and sometimes touched the walls as if feeling the vibrations of the world. The nurse watched them and noticed they never slept long. She asked the linguist why they stayed awake so much. The linguist said maybe they were listening for danger. One evening, one of them pointed at her and said, "Protect." She didn't know what to say. The translator repeated "protect" many times, and she wondered if they were trying to tell her something about Earth. Then one night a new signal came from space, but this time it was not from the hunters. It was coming from a different direction. The linguist analyzed it and found it was similar to the refugees' own frequency. The refugees reacted with joy for the first time since the crash. They touched the glass and their lights turned bright gold. The translator caught a few words from them that said, "Our kind still live." The nurse smiled for them, but the linguist felt worry. If more of their kind were coming, then the hunters would not be far behind. News broke the next morning that several small craft had entered the atmosphere and landed in different oceans. The governments of the world were silent again. The general guessed they were rescue ships for the refugees. The linguist thought they were survivors trying to warn Earth. Either way, the hunters would come again soon. Rafi said that maybe humans should prepare to fight. The general looked at him and said, "Fight with what?" No one knew. The refugees spent the next day building something small from pieces of their broken ship that had been stored in a lab. It looked like a circle of light. The linguist helped them without telling the general. She asked what it was, and they answered SHIELD. They said it could hide a part of the planet from being seen for a short time. The linguist told the nurse, who ran to tell the general. He came to see it himself and asked if it could hide the whole world. The translator answered only a place. The general said, "Then hide this island." The refugees nodded and started their work. When the night came, the red light returned, but weaker. The shadow in the sky appeared again, but seemed uncertain. The refugees stood together and raised their hands toward the ceiling. The circle they had built began to shine. A soft wave spread out from it, covering the island in a faint glow. The radar screens went blank. The shadow stopped moving. The linguist looked outside and saw stars again. It was working. The hunters could not see them for now. The general thanked the refugees and promised to protect them. But he also knew the shield would not last long. The linguist asked how much time they had. The translator said a short circle, which they guessed meant a few days. The nurse said maybe that was enough to make the world understand that these beings needed help, not fear. She begged the general to send out a message telling everyone what really happened. He hesitated, but then agreed. The message was broadcast to all channels. It said the visitors who crashed on Earth were peaceful and being hunted by a force unknown. It asked all nations to come together to defend the planet and those who had sought safety here. The message spread everywhere. Some people laughed, but many listened. For the first time since the first crash, people from different countries began to talk about working together. Scientists from rival nations shared data. Pilots who once trained for war began to plan joint defense missions. Ordinary people sent messages of hope online and painted signs saying "Stand for Peace." The nurse read some of them to the refugees, and they seemed to glow a little brighter each time. But the hunters were still out there. The linguist picked up faint signals that meant they were searching the area again. The refugees knew they could not hide forever. One of them told the nurse through the translator that when the shield failed, the hunters would come and test Earth's strength. The nurse said humanity would stand with them. The refugee looked at her for a long time and said, "You kind, strong heart." Days passed and the shield began to weaken. The refugees grew tired from keeping it active. The general prepared for what was coming. The linguist stayed by the radios trying to send messages of peace to the hunters, hoping they might listen. Rafi helped repair boats in case evacuation was needed, but deep down he knew there would be nowhere to run if the attack came. The nurse spent every moment with the refugees, holding their hands and whispering that they were not alone anymore. The night before the shield was expected to fail, the sky was calm and clear. Everyone on the island gathered outside. The refugees stood in the middle, surrounded by soldiers and scientists. The general looked up at the stars and said quietly that this was the line between fear and courage. The linguist recorded everything, hoping one day people would remember that night. The nurse closed her eyes and prayed that the hunters would see that Earth was not like the world they had destroyed. As the first light of dawn touched the ocean, the shield began to fade. The glow around the island dimmed until it was gone. The refugees looked up, waiting for the sky to change again. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a bright flash appeared high above the clouds and the air grew warm. The hunters had returned. But this time the world was ready to stand. The sky filled with white fire as the hunters came down again. The air trembled and the ground shook so hard that the waves crashed far inland. Every living thing seemed to hold its breath. The refugees stood close together with their light flickering between silver and blue. The humans around them felt fear, but also something new inside them, a kind of strength that came from knowing they were standing together. The general shouted orders to move the equipment underground. The soldiers ran to secure the base. The linguist stayed by the radio, trying to send a final message to warn the world that the attack had begun. The nurse stood beside the refugees and held one of their hands because she knew they were afraid too. All across the planet, strange lights appeared in the sky. Some fell into the oceans. Some hovered above cities, and some vanished before touching the ground. People everywhere could see them. Every country sent out warnings. The news said this was the largest unknown event in history. Some people prayed and others ran, but many stayed still watching the sky because they wanted to see what would happen next. For the first time, humans were united by one feeling that no one could name. On the island, the general received messages from nearby bases saying their power systems were failing. The hunters had sent waves of energy that made all machines weak. The linguist noticed that the refugees were glowing brighter each time one of those waves hit. She realized they could absorb the energy for a short time. She told the general, who quickly made a plan. He said if they could use the refugees' power to keep the island systems alive, they might be able to send one more message to the world. The refugees agreed and placed their hands on the machines. The lights blinked back to life. The linguist began to record what was happening while the nurse watched their faces full of pain but determination. The radio came alive again. The linguist heard messages from ships and planes all over the world. Some were calling for help while others said they had seen the enemy. No one had a clear picture, but one word kept repeating: massive. The hunters' ships were so large they covered the horizon. The linguist sent a signal through the radio repeating the same phrase again and again. Stand together. The general told her to keep sending it no matter what happened. Suddenly the ocean near the island began to boil. A dark shape rose out of the water. It was a part of one of the hunter ships that had hidden beneath the sea. The soldiers aimed their weapons, but the general told them to hold fire, because nothing they had could hurt it. The refugees stepped forward. Their bodies became bright enough to light the whole island. The nurse could hardly see through the glow. The linguist felt a vibration in her chest like a deep hum. The refugees were sending another signal. The ship paused as if listening. The hum grew stronger until the machines around them started shaking. The general ordered everyone to move back. Then a beam of light shot from the refugees straight into the sky. The hunter ship responded with a beam of its own, but it missed them and struck the water. Steam rose high into the air and rain began to fall. The battle between the two lights went on for minutes that felt like hours. The refugees' glow started to fade. The nurse ran to them, but the heat was too much. She could only call their names. The linguist recorded every sound, hoping to understand it later. Finally, the bright beam from the refugees broke apart and vanished. The hunter ship stopped moving. For a few seconds there was silence. Then the massive ship began to sink back into the sea. The refugees collapsed to the ground. The nurse ran to them and saw they were still breathing but weak. The general ordered everyone to help. The linguist checked the radar and saw that many hunter ships around the world were retreating. The signal from the refugees must have reached them. It did not destroy them, but it confused them. They did not know what had happened. The general said this was their chance to send a strong message to the whole planet. The linguist agreed and began to prepare a transmission that would tell the world the hunters could be stopped if humans stood united. The nurse stayed beside the refugees while they slowly regained their strength. News spread fast. Many nations began to work together. Scientists shared data about the strange energy fields. Pilots began flying missions not to attack, but to map the hunter ship's movements. People on the ground helped each other instead of fighting. In some cities, strangers opened their doors to refugees and strangers. The linguist cried when she heard stories of people risking their lives to save others they had never met. She told the nurse that maybe the refugees had given humanity more than they realized. The nurse nodded and said maybe that is why they came here. Days passed and the sky stayed quiet. The hunters did not attack again, but their ships could still be seen high above the atmosphere. The general said they were waiting for something. The linguist guessed they were studying humans again. The refugees told her that the hunters did not understand kindness or unity. They only understood power. She asked if there was a way to show them that power without war. The refugee leader said maybe by joining hearts and light together. The linguist did not fully understand, but she believed them. That night, the refugees asked to be taken outside. The nurse and linguist helped them walk to the shore. They stood by the ocean and raised their hands to the sky. Their lights began to pulse in rhythm. The nurse felt the air change. The linguist checked her instruments and saw signals spreading from the island into space. It was not an attack signal, but something else, something that looked like a message of peace. She translated part of it, and the words came out as "We protect, not destroy." The next morning the hunters moved again, but not toward Earth. Their ships turned slowly and began to drift away. The general could not believe it. The linguist said maybe the message reached them. Maybe they finally understood that humans were not a threat, but defenders of life. The refugees said softly through the translator that the destroyers had paused but not changed. They might return one day. The nurse asked if they would stay on Earth. The refugees said, "For now we stay and learn peace." The world celebrated the strange calm. People called it the day the sky listened. Scientists studied the recordings from the linguist and confirmed that a non-hostile signal had been sent from Earth that matched the frequency of the hunter fleet. No one could explain why it worked, but everyone felt thankful. The general sent reports to the leaders of every nation saying that Earth owed its peace to the unity of people and the courage of the refugees who had once been strangers. Life on the island slowly returned to something close to normal. The soldiers repaired the damaged buildings. The linguist continued studying the language of the refugees. The nurse spent time teaching them about Earth's plants and animals. Rafi helped them build a small garden near the beach where they grew bright blue flowers that glowed at night. The general said it looked like hope blooming in the dark. Months passed and the world began to rebuild. The fear slowly faded, but the memory remained. People no longer looked at the sky with only fear. They also looked with wonder. The refugees became symbols of peace. Many wanted to meet them, but the general kept their location secret to protect them. The linguist said maybe one day they could speak to the world themselves. The nurse agreed, but said not yet because they still needed to heal. One evening, as the sun set over the ocean, the refugees gathered near the water again. The nurse and linguist joined them. The air shimmered and a faint light appeared far out at sea. The refugees said their kind had come again, but not in war. It was a small ship carrying survivors who had escaped the hunters long ago. The general gave permission for them to land. When they arrived, they were gentle and quiet. They brought with them small stones that glowed softly and said, "These are memories." They placed them in the sand near the garden. The light from the stones mixed with the glow of the flowers. The nurse said it looked like the earth itself was smiling. That night, the refugees sang for the first time in human hearing. The sound was soft and endless, like the wind through trees. The soldiers listened and some cried. The linguist recorded it and translated a few words. It said, "We are not lost, for we found home." The nurse looked at them and whispered, "Welcome home." The general stood at a distance and saluted them not as aliens but as allies. The next morning, a new message went out to every part of the world. It said that peace had been made between the visitors and the people of Earth. It asked that no one see them as outsiders anymore. It reminded everyone that the true power of Earth was not its weapons but its kindness. The message was signed by leaders from many nations together for the first time in history. The linguist smiled when she read it because she knew this was what the refugees had hoped for. But far beyond the stars, the hunters were still watching. The linguist sometimes picked up faint signals on her machines that sounded like whispers. The refugees said they were echoes of the old war fading away. The nurse hoped they were right. Still, she stayed ready because she had promised to protect them. She believed that if the hunters ever returned, Earth would not hide. Humanity had changed forever. They had learned what it meant to stand between the innocent and danger. As the sun rose on another quiet day, the island looked peaceful. The sea was calm. The air was clear. The refugees stood together looking at the horizon. The nurse joined them, and for a long time they said nothing. The linguist watched them and thought about how much had changed since the day they crashed by accident. What had begun as fear had become friendship. What had started as chaos had become a lesson. And somewhere high above the clouds, the hunters who once saw only prey had seen something stronger than power. They had seen compassion. The world moved on, but it never forgot. The story of the refugees and the people who protected them was told everywhere. Children learned about it in schools. Artists painted it on walls. Poets wrote songs about the day the strangers came and the humans chose to stand between them and danger. The general retired and said he had finally seen what real courage looked like. The nurse stayed with the refugees who had decided to live on Earth. The linguist kept studying their words and one day translated a final message from them that said, "We came by accident but stayed by choice, because your world taught us hope." Years passed since the day the refugees crashed on Earth and the hunters vanished into the dark sky. The world was no longer the same. Nations that once fought over borders began to share knowledge. Cities rebuilt not just with steel but with care. People started to look beyond their differences and remember the day they all stood together for something greater than themselves. The story of the island became a symbol of hope. It was told in schools and broadcast in every language. People called it the day humanity grew up. The refugees lived quietly on the island that was now protected by an international treaty. No one was allowed to enter without permission. The general had retired, but he often visited them. The nurse never left. She stayed because she said her heart belonged where kindness first won. The linguist kept her work alive and made sure their voices were never forgotten. Rafi had opened a small workshop near the beach where he built simple machines that worked with both human and refugee technology. He said he wanted to make things that brought peace, not destruction. The world admired them but also respected their silence. The refugees had changed too. Their lights were no longer dim but soft and steady like the glow of stars. They had learned many human ways. They helped the island people grow food and taught them how to use light to heal wounds and clean water. The nurse watched them every day and said they had become a part of Earth. Children from nearby villages sometimes came to the shore just to see the blue flowers that the refugees had planted. The flowers spread naturally across the sand, and their light could be seen from the ocean at night. Sailors called it the Shore of Peace. One morning, the linguist woke to strange sounds coming from her radio. They were faint but familiar. She knew the frequency at once. It was the same one used by the hunters long ago. Her heart raced. She ran to the beach where the refugees were gathering. They had already felt it. Their bodies were glowing faster than usual and their eyes looked troubled. The general who had returned to the island for a visit saw it too. He asked if the hunters were back. The translator repeated the refugees' answer. It said maybe not hunters, maybe lost ones. The linguist checked her machines again. The signal was weak but steady. It was not an attack wave. It was a distress call. The refugees said the voice sounded like their own kind calling for help. The nurse asked if it could be another group of survivors. They nodded slowly. The general asked where it came from. The linguist looked at the readings and said it was far beyond the moon. The refugees said they could try to reach them, but they needed power from both human and their own technology. Rafi said he could build something to send the signal back stronger. The general agreed and ordered everyone to help. For 3 days they worked without sleep. They used parts from old machines and pieces of the refugees' ship that had been kept safe in the lab. The linguist managed the frequencies while Rafi built the transmitter. The nurse helped where she could and kept the refugees strong. Finally, when the sun was setting on the third day, they finished. The refugees stood in a circle around the transmitter and touched the metal with their hands. The machine lit up and a bright beam shot into the sky. It was so strong that even people in nearby cities saw it. The signal carried a message written in both human and refugee code. It said, "We hear you, you are not alone, come home to peace." The night stayed calm, but everyone waited. Hours passed, then the signal came back. It was the same voice, but stronger. The translator turned it into words that made the nurse cry. It said, "We come in peace, we are tired of war, we seek light." The general stood still for a long time before saying, "Then let them come." The linguist sent another message giving them Earth's safe coordinates. The refugees watched the sky with eyes full of hope. Days later, lights appeared far beyond the clouds. They were smaller than the hunter ships and moved gently. People across the world saw them and waited to see if this time the visitors would come as friends. The news showed pictures of the lights and said maybe this was a sign that peace was not just for humans, but for all beings. The world's leaders stayed quiet, but their armies did not move. The general told his men that no weapon should be raised unless there was danger. On the seventh night, the new ships entered the atmosphere. They came down slowly over the ocean near the island. The refugees ran to the beach and raised their arms in greeting. The ships landed softly on the water and opened like flowers. From them stepped beings that looked like the refugees but thinner and dimmer, as if they had been traveling for too long. The nurse and linguist went forward without fear. The translator came alive, and the first words spoken were, "Thank you for hearing us." The refugees from the island embraced the newcomers, and the lights around them grew bright enough to turn night into day. The linguist recorded everything. She wrote that it was the most peaceful first meeting between different beings in history. The newcomers were weak and hungry. They said they had been hiding for years from the hunters who had destroyed their homeworld. They had wandered through the dark, hoping to find a place where light still lived. The nurse and the island team gave them food and water and treated their wounds. The refugees sang for them, and the sound carried far across the waves. The linguist said it was a song of return. The next morning, the sky was clear and golden. The general called the world leaders through the secure line and told them what had happened. There was silence for a while, then one by one they agreed to send aid and supplies. They said it was time to welcome the visitors, not fear them. Planes brought food and doctors. Scientists came to learn but not to control. For the first time in history, Earth opened its arms without expecting anything in return. The refugees thanked them and said the kindness of humans had become their shield. Months passed and the island became a place of unity. People from every country came to help build homes and research stations that used both human and refugee knowledge. Together, they created machines that could clean the ocean and lights that could grow crops in barren soil. The nurse said this was how real healing looked. The linguist gave lessons to young students who wanted to learn the refugee language. The refugees learned human stories and music in return. The general said the world had finally learned what it meant to be one family. But far away, the hunters' signals still echoed faintly. The linguist could sometimes hear them on quiet nights like whispers at the edge of the stars. The refugees told her not to worry, because they believed that even the destroyers might one day hear the song of peace. The nurse said maybe that was the purpose of everything that had happened. Not to fight the darkness, but to teach it how to see the light. One evening, as the sun sank into the ocean, the refugees gathered everyone on the beach. They said they wanted to show something new. They held hands with the humans around them and began to glow brighter than ever before. The light spread from them into the sand and water and up into the sky. It painted the clouds in gold and blue. The linguist recorded it and said it was not light made of energy, but light made of emotion. The refugees said they wanted to leave a sign for the universe that Earth was now a place of safety. The nurse cried because it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. After that night, the refugees said they would travel again, but not to leave Earth forever. They said they wanted to carry the story of humanity to other worlds and show them that even a planet once divided by fear could become a beacon of hope. The general asked if they would return. The translator said, "We will always return where we found heart." The nurse hugged them and whispered that Earth would always be their home. When the ships lifted off, people across the world watched from screens. They saw the lights rise and vanish into the stars. The linguist stood on the beach holding the radio. After a while, she heard their last message. It said, "Thank you for standing between us and danger. Thank you for showing that even in fear there can be love." The linguist smiled and said quietly, "Safe journey, friends." Years later, the world still remembered them. The island had become a place of peace where no weapons were allowed. Children came there to learn about the day humans protected those who were different. The nurse grew old, but she never left. She often sat by the blue flowers at night and watched the sea. Sometimes she said she could still see faint lights far above the horizon. The linguist, who had grown gray too, said maybe it was them watching over Earth. The general who had passed away was buried near the garden with a small stone that glowed softly at night. It had been given by the refugees before they left. It said in both languages, "Courage is love in action." One night the nurse sat alone on the beach listening to the waves. The sky was full of stars, and she thought she saw one of them blink in a familiar way. She smiled and whispered, "We are safe now." She closed her eyes and listened to the calm sea, knowing that the story of the refugees and the humans who protected them would never fade. It had become part of Earth's heart. Forever and somewhere in the endless sky, their friends carried that same light to other worlds, teaching others what they had learned here, that kindness is stronger than fear, and that standing between the helpless and danger is what makes any being truly human.